Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In this episode, we're exploring the work of British Army Chaplains assigned to the airborne units during the war. These men landed with the troops by parachute or glider, often behind enemy lines, sharing the dangers and challenges of frontline operations through North Africa, Sicily, Italy, D-Day, Arnhem and the crossing of the Rhine. I'm joined by Linda Parker. Linda has written a number of books exploring the work of British Army Chaplains, and her latest is Nearer, My God to Thee, Airborne Chaplains in the Second World War. But before that, this podcast is made possible by listeners like yourself who enjoy the show and help me find the time to put it together by becoming patrons, by committing $1 or $2 each month via Patreon. You can find out more at patreon.com/WW2podcast. If Patreon is not your thing for whatever reason and you would like to join the gang, go to ww2podcast.com/support and you'll find information on how to support the show via PayPal. In doing so, if you check the box to be added to the mailing list, I will send you links to extras when I have them. So that's www2podcast.com/support. Linda, thanks for joining me. So we're looking at World War II, but I wonder what the history of the military chaplain is. My assumption is the official military Padre comes out of the First World War. Would I be correct?
Well, there were military chaplains in the army from the Crimea onwards. But the First World War was the catalyst for greatly increasing their numbers and giving them a proper role to do. I think their role just sort of materialised. They made themselves a role in the First World War, which then went on for the rest of the century and changed in the Second World War and is changing now. But it's the First World War where they really come to the fore. At the end of the war, they become the Royal Army Chaplains Department because the King said, they'd done a really good job, so they would now be the Royal Army Chaplains Department. So it's a very big learning curve, the First World War for chaplains. They didn't really have a clue of what to do when they got there, first of all, in the first few months. The regulars went, and they had a pretty good idea of what was expected, but then there was a huge influx of temporary army chaplains who just had to go and make their role. They just rolled up and did what they thought was necessary wherever they were.
So does that mean coming out of the First World War, they start to think about almost codifying their role? Do they start a chaplain training school? Is that what happens? They formalise the
interwar years. Their numbers were taken down quite a lot. At the end of the First World War, they got to the stage where nearly all the people involved knew what they were to do. And sometimes it would be in the front line, sometimes it would be at a dressing station, sometimes it would be in the trenches. So they knew what to do in different situations. But then in the interwar years, the Army Chaplains Department shrunk. At then the beginning of the Second World War, they were faced with this again. Off we go to war again, what do we do? But in the Second World War, they had proper training courses for them. Actually, at the end of the First World War, they had some proper training courses. The Second World War, almost immediately, they started sending them on a course before they went out.
It's amazing that First World War it's almost it points out to people what to do for the next war. So there's almost a cadre that could pick up the bat and off they go.
One of my ideas is that it was the Second World War chaplains, and particularly the Airborne Second World War chaplains, that was the link between what happened in the First World War and modern conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. It was where they changed again in the Second World War, and that's more or less, it's building on that experience that chaplains use now when they're in conflict.
So if we look from a denominational point of view, is it the Church of England? How does it work? Do they have everybody on board and they somehow come up with a generic military religion?
In the First World War and to a larger extent in the Second World War, because people used to put down Church of England on their form, in theory there were an awful lot more Church of England soldiers than anything else, and there were actually, I think, as well. But then you had more in proportion. You had more Church of England chaplains, but you had all denominations in the First and the Second World War, and they did make some effort to put the right chaplain with with the right regiment. For example, a lot of the Scottish regiments had Scottish Presbyterian ministers. There was a big argument with David Lloyd George in the First World War, about he wanted to make sure that the 30th Welsh Division had good Welsh Methodist ministers with them. Didn't always work, but most soldiers, but certainly by the Second World War, would have had in their army grouping, whether it be a battalion, regiment or whatever, would have a Roman Catholic and a Free Church, either Methodist, Presbyterian, and an Anglican. But then again, many more Anglicans in proportion than the rest.
Could a Catholic chaplain do a service for, might they do a service for the Church of England? Because presumably they can't be everywhere all the time, and it might be a bit...
No, absolutely. They all matched in between. The Catholics were a little bit iffy about it because of their theology of communion. The Airborne Padres particularly, before they went off on their missions, discussed with each other they would all bury each other's dead. And they had ecumenical services. So if you had a Methodist, he would do a little service, in the base or when they were out on their operations. So yeah, certainly by the Second World War, they were mixing and matching their denominations quite a lot, except for obviously the Roman Catholics didn't like Anglicans or anything else actually having communion, having mass. But apart from that small fact, it was all seemed to work quite well. And I think that is one of the things in the Second World War that did develop this, and not undenominational, but lesser denominational emphasis. I'll bury your dead, you look after my chap, I look after your chap. I'll bless your chap, you bless my chap.
Pragmatic. It's funny, when I was at school, they used to say, I remember very distinctly we had to fill in forms at school and they said you had to write in your religion. They just said, if you don't know, put down C of E.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what they told all the soldiers, if you haven't got a clue, see your C of E. Yeah. So that's the way it works. Yeah.
All these kids who'd never been to church had no idea what about religion. Would you? C of E. There we go. If we look specifically at the Airborne Chaplains, airborne troops are obviously a new invention in the Second World War. Are the chaplains assigned to these units right from the start, as the Airborne's actually created? Does someone say, "Hang on, we need to give you a contingent of chaplains"?
Well, the first two chaplains, they were just sent there. And there's a lovely story about the first one, Robert Watkins, rolling up at the gate, and his instructions said, go to so-and-so, so-and-so, bracket P, regiment, so-and-so battalion, bracket P. And when he got there, he discovered that this was parachuting, which was in its infancy. And he said, if his transport hadn't gone, he'd let back on it. And he went on to become one of the most bravest and decorated airborne chaplains in the Second World War. So no, originally they would just post, and the idea was that they would just look after the pastoral needs and of the people on the base, that they weren't going to go and jump. But these two, Watkins was a Methodist and another one, Bernard Egan, they were the first two that were rolled up there. And they decided if they were going to stand any chance of being close to their men, they had to do everything with them. So it was a very rigorous training, the parachute training, like today they have P companies up there, and really very rigorous training. The chaplains did it all with them, everything. Then as more and more chaplains came in, then it became a more volunteer thing, because people knew then if you were going to be an airborne chaplain, you would be jumping or you would be going down with a glider, and then it was more voluntary. They'd have to volunteers. But they used to go around the camps trying to find the fittest chaplains and say, would you like to come and join the Airborne Chaplains? And they were all 33 was considered old for an airborne chaplain. They weren't initially volunteers, but then they became, and some were volunteered by their superiors. Oh, we've got a nice young chaplain here, we'll send him, yeah.
I made a note of it about how many of them seem to play rugby. So it's not as if they're all shrinking violets.
No, they're all big rugby players. I noticed that when I was writing. I thought, well, they're all playing rugby. So I think they were sort of very much of this muscular Christianity sort of thing,
I could see them all organising perhaps cricket, but rugby was a slight surprise. Though, as you say, if they're training with the paras, they must have a high level of fitness and physical strength. But yeah, the rugby thing was quite amusing me. So when they're on base, what is it? They're initially, as you say, expected to be on base. What are they envisaged to be doing on base? What are they, just Sunday services or?
Yeah, Sunday services and weekday services, and liaising with families. Any sort of problems with families. They go out to speak to the wife who had threatened to divorce one of the parachute parachutists. And also they were in the forefront of developing something called Padre's Hour, which was not a formal church service. It was just people came in, I think they could smoke. They sat around informally and they sort of quizzed the Padre on all the questions that they wanted to know about religion. And apparently for the Padres, it was a real nerve-wracking experience because they never knew what the men were going to ask them. But it was all to do with getting away from this idea of a formal church parade. They did have church parade on Sundays, but they wanted to get away from that and actually get down and speak to the men. And because they did all the training with them, then they were very well liked and they were popular and they were known. So people were more likely to come along to this Padre's Hour and say, and sort of speak their minds. I think they did speak their mind quite, what is the church for? You're a bunch of hypocrites, that sort of thing. But
it was voluntary. Yeah. They didn't have to go.
No, Padre's Hour wasn't voluntary as such, I don't think. No, I think it was sort of organised, shall we say? Yes. Well, it's always been a compulsion in the army, isn't it?
Well, yeah. Well, and it's introduced. Am I right in saying? Did I read this wrong? It's introduced by it's Boy Browning.
That's right. Yeah. Oh, he was a big fan of that. He thought this is a jolly good idea. Yeah.
For some reason, if you read, I've not read a biography of him, but the vague things I read, he never struck me as being someone who would suggest such a thing. But I don't.
No, I know what you mean. Sort of very smart, sort of reserved, sort of chap, isn't he? Yes.
Yeah, and he's married to. Isn't he married to Virginia Woolf? He sort of somehow seems a loose. Daphne du Maurier. Yeah, that's it. That's it. It seems a loose character. Perhaps it's too much of watching. What's the film with him in? Bridge Too Far.
That's right. Yeah, I think we've all got the idea of Dirk Bogarde now in our minds. But he does look a lot. Dirk Bogarde did look a lot like him. So
sort of suave. Yeah. So is it a non? I mean, assuming it is a non-combatant role. I mean, beyond religion, did they? What specialist training did they have in the field? What were they envisaged to be having to do?
They did quite a lot of medical training so that they could do, anaesthetists bits and they wouldn't be shocked when they had to help with operations and bring in the wounded and things like that. So their role on operations was, as well as looking after the spiritual needs and doing little services wherever they could, a lot of them were injured, going out to collect the wounded, and then they would help in the field hospitals. There's a nice little bit in the chapter on Arnhem where a medical officer in Arnhem says, yes, they helped us medically, but it wasn't only that, it was their presence and their guidance. So it was a sort of double role. They were actually, doing medical things, but that wasn't their main purpose. They were there also to talk to people, to bless them, to give a cigarette, to write home, all kinds of things. You wouldn't believe how many things a padre had to do.
So, I mean, were they armed? I mean, it is an interesting question. When a padre jumps, my assumption is they shouldn't be armed.
They weren't supposed to be armed at all. But there was a slight difference between the 1st Airborne Division and the 6th Airborne Division. I haven't come across anyone in the 1st Airborne Division in North Africa and who were in Arnhem who had any guns. It's not to say they didn't help military things, which is another thing, but they weren't armed. But in the 6th Airborne Division, the chap that was killed, George Parry, murdered in a first aid station, his commanding officer believed that he was armed. There was another one, a Roman Catholic called Briscoe, who got wounded in a barn, and he said to the doctor when they thought the Germans were approaching, quick, take my pistol off me, because I'm not supposed to have it. If they find it, I'll be done for. And the doctor quickly took his gun off him. So that's two. And also, Lieutenant Colonel Pine Coffin used to leave Sten guns by the planes, right? So if any medical or spiritual staff wanted to take one, they could. So it's a very grey area. No is the answer. They should not be armed. But evidently some were. Not to kill anyone, but in self-defence.
Which could be to kill someone. It's an interesting grey. Are they doing it to wave it at somebody to ask them not to, or yeah? I
mean, I think it's a real minority that carried a gun, but it did happen. But on the other hand, you see, Fraser McCluskey, who was the man with the SAS behind the lines in France, was very, very much against being armed, but he travelled around the forests in in France in a jeep with a bodyguard with a really big machine gun on, Bren gun on the things. So he didn't have any armour, but he was in a jeep that was well armoured. So it's all very grey, isn't it? It's he was quite vociferous about, no, we must not be armed, but he had a bodyguard.
Well, yeah. Well, I did have a question actually about, did they have Batman? Did they have a Batman?
Yes. They did have a Batman, but they always chose a Batman that was useful in battle. And the Batman did tend to look after them a bit. Fraser McCluskey didn't have a Batman, but he had this sort of bodyguard who sort of adopted him and looked after him. At home, they had a Batman like any officer, any senior officer would have. But in battle, no, the Batman might have made them a cup of tea every now and then, but he was a fighting man, their Batman. Because they couldn't afford just to take somebody on a glider whose only role was to look after the Padre, could they?
Well, I did wonder, it's, or perhaps he's he had a curate that followed him round, but...
Batman for Airborne Padres is a nominal role. Once they hit the ground, they were soldiers and who occasionally made their Padre a cup of tea.
Do we know how the soldiers viewed the Padre? Do they think he was a nuisance? I mean, it's World War One. They get this idea of being the God's grocer because they distributed cigarettes and chocolate. I mean, do we know what the soldiers thought of them? I mean, it might be two different things between think one thing when they're on base and another thing when they're in the field.
Absolutely, you've hit the nail on the head there, because Fraser McCluskey would say, when I was with the SAS men, they were big, tough men, and he had services for them at base, which weren't all that popular. But once they were behind the French lines, hid in the forest, he said they all gathered round, and it was a lovely family atmosphere because they were there, we were all together, and they all showed what he described as a genuine faith. So, and also because they trained with them, they had such a much better relationship with them, particularly than perhaps some of the First World War Padres or some base Padres with the army. There's quite a lot of evidence with Airborne Padres, particularly, that they were at one with the men. Men realised that they were useful in lots of ways, as well as being of spiritual comfort. And they all rallied round, and in the rare occasions they could have little services. In North Africa, they had a service at a minehead, and apparently they all sat on the shafts and the machinery, and they all gathered round like that. So, no, I think I'm pretty confident in saying that there's a very close relationship, especially in battle. I haven't come across any evidence to say that anyone said, they're a blooming nuisance, which in the First World War I did come across.
Well, there's that slight thing for the Airborne that the Padre is not going anywhere once he's dropped, is he? It's not like he could go back and invent some excuse to head back to safety. He's really is in it with them, aren't they?
Particularly at Arnhem, they certainly weren't going anywhere, were they?
So when they go into action, is there ever any discussion that the Padre should or shouldn't be taking? Because he's, of course, taking up that vital seat in a plane that could have another fighting body on. I
think that shows you, though, something, doesn't it? That, if you've got a stick of 12 men in an aeroplane and you've given up one of those seats for a Padre, the men and the officers are not going to allow that to happen unless they think that is a worthwhile place. But looking at it logically, that's the bottom line, isn't it? They wouldn't have let them go unless they thought they were doing a good job and they were necessary. Parachutists are not one to hide their feelings, are they? If they thought it wasn't worth taking the Padre, then they would have told the senior officers, "Come on, we can get another man in here."
Well, it struck me as interesting how many senior officers seem to take one with them. There's a number of senior officers.
They quite often ended up in the HQ glider or stick, and I think that, because they didn't have any axe to grind, lots of senior officers would sort of run things past them and say, "What do you think about this? What are the moral implications of this?" Or, do you think I'm doing the right thing? Because they didn't have to take any notice of what the chaplain said back to them, did they? It was just a sounding board. Just before Sicily, there's a chap called Hopkinson who was sending in gliders when really he had no idea how it would all work out. And it didn't work out very well in Sicily with the gliders at all. It was an absolute disaster. But he took the senior chaplain Harper for a little walk by the sea, by the sunset, he said, and apparently sort of like opened his heart to him, I really don't know this is going to work out, sort of.
Well, it's interesting. Is it Gale takes one with him, and he's the senior British paratrooper, isn't he? Overlord Husky. Does he Gale jump? He's certainly at varsity. He must jump into Arnhem.
Yes, I think he is in Arnhem. Yes, he is. Certainly.
And and I think he takes one with him as well, doesn't he? But which I think it's interesting because presumably if they've got the ear of the men and the ear of the CO, there's an interesting go between the two. That's why I was thinking about being a union rep.
When they were doing their training, after they came from Ringway and went to their units, there were some men then that had done their required amount of jumps, but then started to refuse to jump when they were doing more training. And I think there were a few, I can't remember the reasons for this, but there were some significant pointers. They thought they weren't being treated well or they were being used too much. And it was several of the chaplains that managed to sort that out and get a compromise whereby you did more jumps before you signed a bit of paper that said, if I refuse to jump after now, I'm court-martialed. So it gave them a little bit more wriggle room before they got to the stage where they refused to jump and they were whisked off to military jail. And that was, I can't remember the name of the Padre now, I think it was John Hall, but one or two of them in the camp in Tidworth did quite a lot of sorting out between men and officers. So it's a bit like a union rep. I wish I'd thought of that before I wrote the book.
As I said, as a union rep and psychologist, it somehow seemed to be doing a bit of those two strange roles. So their first major, presumably, baptism of fire will be North Africa. How did that go for them? Was there anything they learned there that then gets changed down the line? I mean, I'm sure the whole of every jump will have been a learning process for the airborne full stop, but I wonder if for the chaplains, if there was something that said, actually, we've got this wrong, or what did they do that they weren't expected to do?
Well, I think the first thing they realised is when they jumped when they all jumped, because they were all jumping for the first time, the troops and everything, that there were going to be casualties as soon as they hit the ground with people who had died, by jumping in the wrong way or getting tangled up or whatever. And then they realised that they're in North Africa, particularly. North Africa is a bit different from Sicily and Arnhem because they were there for the long haul. They were there for several months. And it did give them a chance to sort out what they were doing. Of course, one had a very exciting time, the one with the 2nd Battalion with John Frost, because he more or less took over commanding a platoon, and then he got injured, and then he got captured. And then when they put him on a flight with the doctor from Tunis back to Rome, he managed to blow up the plane on the way back. So coming back to your point about were they armed? No, but blowing up a plane was quite. No one was hurt when they blew up the plane. They managed to do it. But as they got off the plane, they lit some time pencils in the back and blew up the plane. So so that was quite exciting there. I think generally, in answer to your question, it's that learning curve. North Africa gave them a good few months. The ones that were there in North Africa gave them a good few months to get used to it. And also, those were the people who then went to Arnhem for the 1st Airborne Brigade. They missed D-Day, but they went to Arnhem then. And they were also in Sicily as well. So the people who went to North Africa carried on throughout the war, really. It was only D-Day that they missed. And some of the glider pilots, chaplains, went to D-Day as well.
It's It's Padre McDonald, isn't it? Who
Murder McDonald, yes.
Who blows up the plane. And I don't know quite how you describe it. It's sort of sort of strange dynamic idea of war and peace there, isn't he? When he's blowing up planes and escaping and assuming combat duties, almost. He
had started, and in Arnhem, you see, Robert Watkins did a lot of organising of troops. He didn't have a gun, but he organised those troops. He told them where to go. He reported back. He was acting as an officer, really, without actually firing. Because there was no one else to do it, in the walk into Arnhem, his battalion got really hard. But lots of the officers were killed, and he gathered them all together and carried on.
Where did they fit in? Were they even part of the chain of command? I mean, they have a rank.
They had a rank, but no, they wouldn't have given orders unless they were disobeying their own orders not to give orders. If you see what I mean. They weren't supposed to give orders or organise anything in a military fashion, but some of them did.
And presumably their men followed them because of they have a rank, full stop. But also presumably there's a respect there that allows them, presumably the NCOs, to say they we're doing what he says, which is an interesting relationship that I guess somehow between God and the men and the war.
That's very profound. Would you like to unpack that a bit?
Well, it is a funny one, isn't it? When you're not supposed to do anything, but you do, and you're not in the chain of command, but people will do as you tell them. So you assume you're assuming a role which is the best for them, but at the same time, it's potentially not the most peaceful of roles. It's not a pacifist way of doing it. So it all sits in a very peculiar.
It does. Yes. I think that dilemma was far more prevalent for the Airborne Padres than perhaps for a lot of other Army Padres, because they were there immediately with them. And as you said, they weren't going anywhere, were they? They weren't going back.
So what was the drill when the Padre jumps? When he hits the ground, do they have a, 1, 2, 3, this is what we're going to do? I mean, the men obviously know, they're briefed on what they have to do. What's the Padre doing? He surely can't be running around holding services and this, that and the other.
For example, now Robert Watkins, when he landed in Sicily, he walked with the men to their, he went with them to where they were supposed to be going. He helped them. I think he helped some people with mosquito bites and things like that. And then, when things kicked off, he actually acted as a liaison between the men at the front and the ambulance. And he walked back and forth telling them what was going on. He was telling the ambulance what was going on further up, and he acted as a liaison there. And then he was briefly captured with some men, and several of the Padres in Sicily managed to gather groups of men together and lead them back to where the Allied troops were. Watkins did that. So it's this sort of informal leadership. Does that make sense? Doing what you can, when you can, and being alert to the ways that you can help. If it's going to be a stretcher bearer, right, somebody's wounded, you go with a stretcher bearer and bring him in. Somebody needs a message taken, you go. Somebody's dying and wants a prayer, you do a prayer.
Yeah, it's very pragmatic. Do they wear a dog collar?
Some did, but not very often. In Arnhem, somebody was told, yes, do wear a dog collar, because then the men will know who you are, because there's so many men in Arnhem. Obviously, all the Padres weren't new to all of them. Pictures I've seen of them are varied. Some didn't, some did.
It's funny, because I just assumed it'd be part of the uniform. It's so universally recognised. I would have thought, even from the enemy's point of view, it's almost like wearing a red cross.
Yeah, well, they had a Padres armband and a Red Cross armband, so they would be identifiable to the enemy and to other people. I think it comes down to personal choice, really. I think some thought they didn't want to be stand out, and some people thought, yes, they need to know I am the Padre. Because they had Padres badges and armbands, so I think they should have been able to be again.
It's not quite as obvious as a dog collar, though, is it?
No.
Which is a real, it's very symbolic of their role. And there's a lot. What struck me, what surprised me, when we talk about Arnhem, there's a hell of a lot of them go in. 15 chaplains are dropped in. It's a lot, isn't it? So how many men would 15 chaplains are looking after? How many men per Padre? A battalion would have 3 Padres if they were lucky, with different of denominations, but not in Arnhem. I don't think it was more like a Padre, because Robert Watkins was with the 1st Battalion, and Bernard Egan was at the bridge with John Frost with the 2nd Battalion. Quite a few went in with the air landing hospitals, specifically with the hospitals. 2 were with gliders. So it depended really on what unit they were with. Do you know that some battalions were moved en bloc to be airborne? They didn't, they were just moved to be airborne, and their Padre went with them.
If you want to, sort of like
suddenly found himself stuck in a glider.
Yes, absolutely. That is absolutely right. It's 1 minute he was with the Northumberland Fusiliers in York somewhere. Next thing you know, he was learning how to be in a glider. Yes. So in answer to the question, it depended what unit they were in. Some were attached to field hospitals. Some were attached directly to battalions. Some were with gliders, and some just came as Padres to their particular regiment that had been drafted in. Troops in the gliders, for example.
Were they ever considered a liability? Did men feel an affinity to them that they perhaps needed to recklessly look after the Padre?
I've thought a lot about this because modern day chaplains will say that they have to be very careful not to go out on patrol, for example, in Afghanistan or Iraq, if they're going to be a danger to the people who they're going with, if they feel they have to. Sometimes they were allowed to go, and it depended very much on the commander on the spot. But yeah, the same thing, I suppose, would happen in Arnhem, but I didn't come across any evidence of that. I think they were just, because they were always just as one with the men, they weren't considered to be anything particularly special.
Yeah, and if we move to look at after the battle, I mean, presume a number of, well, we mentioned some of them become prisoners of war. Were they told, instructed, suggested how to behave as prisoners of war? Were they expected to stay with the men to look after their men's needs, or were they told to do your best, it's your duty to break out and cause mayhem by being on the run? Right.
Well, there's two parts to our question, really. The first is that some Padres stayed, well, in Arnhem particularly, they chose to stay with the men. They could have, some of them, quite a few of them could have got back over the Rhine. 3 did, because they took men over the Rhine. But the others, quite a lot of the others, chose to stay with them and go to POW camps with them. Because some officers then ended up in officers' POW camps. And I think in some officers' POW camps there were quite a lot of chaplains, but there were chaplains also that went with them because of course it was the end of the war, so they just went with them. And the second part of the question, that again depended on personal things. A few of them tried to escape while they were still in Arnhem. A glider pilot called Arnold Pear jumped off a train, and he ended up being hidden by the Dutch villagers until the end of the war. Daniel McGowan tried to escape and failed. And then the others said, well, we don't want to escape because we need to be here. These men are still sick. We'll stay with the medical staff until they all go off to the German prisoner of war camp. Daniel McGowan escaped once he knew that most of the men were going off to prisoner of war camp, and he left it to the last minute, but then he failed. Murdo MacDonald went to Stalag Luft 3. He was quite friendly with Roger Bushell and some of the great escapers, and he was encouraged them. But he said that he would not escape personally, because he was a chaplain and he thought it was his duty to stay with them. And as it happens, he was transferred to the American compound about 2 months before they made the breakout. I don't know whether he would changed his mind and gone or not, but the Americans give him a medal for the pastoral work he did with the Americans in the American compounds. But no, generally, I think they thought if they were prisoners of war, it was their duty to stay. And like all army chaplains, that's across the board, it's their duty not to escape, to stay and look after them.
When the fighting's over, is it their job to kind of police the battlefield, and was it their job to bury the dead? Did they organise that? Was it all down to them to collect remains?
In North Africa, they went out and collected bodies and brought them back. Sicily was sort of like mowing and out, so I haven't got much evidence of that. In Arnhem, they were trying to arrange with the Germans all the time in the ceasefires, can we bury them? Do you remember in the film, the Bridge Too Far, Kate to Horst in the vicarage? There's a vicarage anyway, which is a first aid post, and in real life, the chaplain there used to take them out and bury them, in the garden in between sort of being shelled. But they didn't always succeed, because I think there was one instance where they arranged for the Germans to bury them after they'd been taken prisoner, and they found out afterwards they hadn't. They just burned them in the back garden or something like that. So yes, that was part of their duty, definitely. To find dead, bury dead, and if they couldn't do it, to try and arrange that it was decently done. After North Africa, Robert Watkins took a team of people back to help tidy up the battlefields, and he arranged for a memorial in the Tamara Valley for all the people there. That was his idea, and he did it because he was really afraid that people would be coming back, because there was a bit of a gap between North Africa and Sicily, and they were still in North Africa. He was afraid that people would be coming back to look at the battlefield and just find their mates' bodies scattered around. So he actually did an awful lot to help get people to clear that up. He liaised with the Commonwealth, with the War Graves Committee, and tried to get that sorted.
It's a hell of a job, because these lads will have known these men, and then one by one they're burying them. My assumption is the burial teams that are helping are different every time, so they're not having to come back day in, day out and do.
In D-Day, that was so, they had to persuade people to help them with the burial. But a few padres at D-Day have said that then there were some men who said, right, I'll help you all the time. Sort of 2 or 3 that would be their core thing, and would help them. And I don't know, perhaps they thought that was a good role if they had to do it, but they did have. But generally, as you said, you'd have some difficulty in persuading people to do it more than a few times. A lot of burials in the Normandy campaign took place under fire as well. So,
I wonder if we take these World War II experiences, and we've sort of alluded to this, how especially, it's as you say, it's the airborne, because I guess that's perhaps even more relevant to today's chaplaincy. How has that been reflected in today's chaplaincy? How did that change it again to what we see today? I mean, the Army's been deployed a hell of a lot in the last few years.
I think that there's a lot of continuity between First World War, Second World War conflicts in between, and today. Continuity in the pastoral and spiritual and services, that they're always there. That's what they're there for. In the First World War, they used to give out cigarettes. Apparently, in Afghanistan, they used to give out Haribos. There's a lot of continuity, as you would imagine, because it's the same God. He's been there all the time, and very similar in the ways that you would do your pastoral job. But I think that the airborne padres in the Second World War really changed. Well, padres in the Second World War generally really changed the game from the First World War. They were trained increasingly throughout the war. They were trained in map reading, what bombs were this, how to defuse this. They had a lot of practical military training. The airborne padres did all the physical training, the P Company, and that only not made them more professional, but it also made them more respected by their men, and it made it became, how can you say, a profession of a padre, a professional padre who knew their job, was part of the army, rather than perhaps in the First World War they were a little bit of an add-on. Just they did marvellous job in the First World War, but they were something separate. They were the church. They would come along and do this and the other. Whereas I think in the Second World War, by the end, they were very well accepted. And Montgomery said he would rather go into battle without his artillery than without his padres. So a bit of hyperbole there, I think, but
it is. I suspect if you told him he had to do that, he might change his mind. But
he probably would have done it. But it was a nice thing. It was a nice thing to say, because he was very friendly with the senior chaplain of the 8th Army, Freddie Hughes. They sort of laid down the basis of good commander padre, and that sort of went all the way down the line, because the top brass were working well together. Then that went all the way down the line.
I have to say that the relationship with the top brass was the bit that I think is almost the most interesting, because when you get certainly with Montgomery, but the more senior you get, there's a lot of weight on your shoulders and a lot of lives there that on your decision could well be lost. And it's interesting that they choose to take a padre. It just makes you wonder how religious they were, possibly before the war, or if they weren't in the field, or indeed were they religious at all? Do they just need someone with some faith, as you say, to talk to?
I think a lot of them were like sort of public school and C of E and establishment families, if you know what I mean. So they've been brought up with a faith. Whether they had retained that in battle is another thing. But I think a lot of people, a lot of your senior commanders had been brought up in the Catholic faith, so quite a lot of them had been to the big Catholic schools, and so they had a faith. But I think to be able to talk to somebody about that and to help them to decide what was morally right, I think these days that's a big role for the padre still. I think the padres are increasingly involved in this is sort of big thing about ethics. Ethics is the big thing in modern day chaplaincy and army circles, So, and I think that's something that has grown and grown and grown, but started, I believe, in the Second World War.
Well, presumably that's because in recent years the role of the army has been much more focused on policing type work rather than direct conflict. Anyway, as we start to digress, that seems like a good place to finish. Linda, thank you for joining me. I enjoyed that very much. Loyal listener, Linda's book is Nearer My God to Thee, Airborne Chaplains in the Second World War. And it's a big thank you to Bob Mathis, who originally suggested the topic last year. Bob's father was a US Army chaplain arriving in Normandy about 3 weeks after D-Day. May 2020 marks the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. So I've got lined up to return Jonathan Trigg to tell us about the German experiences in the closing months of the war. And I'm hoping also to get a bonus episode out in May, but I'm not promising anything as these are strange times. So that's all from me. I hope you all stay fit and well. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.